Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka, host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening and good morning to everybody. So depending on where you are in the world, thank you very much for joining us. Once again, we are here with Professor Stephen Nagy, whom you know very well already because we have been running this series for about a year now. So thank you very much for joining us. And as you already know, today's theme is connectivity, infrastructure and connectivity in context in the region of the Indo-Pacific. So we all have been through these past months. We have been noticing that there are a lot of changes, economic, geopolitical, also social changes. So I believe that there will be a very nice discussion after Stephen finishes his briefing. So Stephen, without any further delay, let's start.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you very much to everyone that's on the call. I see there's a few people in Europe, like Chao Ting, so welcome. And there's a few people in North America, so good morning, Eleanor, and others. I see a friend in Hong Kong, so Nei Ho Ma, I hope you're well, and a few people from other parts of the world, so this is great. Today's theme is looking at supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region, and giving you some context of what they mean. And I think that's really important because we've talked about supply chains a little bit before, but I think sometimes it's a little bit less tangible for people than we may think. And this is why I wanted to bring it up in terms of how we can understand the Indo-Pacific and what are some of the broader trends. So with that, today, I think I'd like to break down my initial comments into three different areas. First, what kind of supply chains exist in this region? Second is what are some of the driving forces that are disrupting those supply chains? And then third, how are we seeing those our responses to those disruptions? So I think that's kind of my framing remarks. And then after that, we can bring in our friends from around the world to share some of their ideas. So when we think about this region, and I encourage you to, if you're sitting in your couch or you're sitting in your computer chair, or you're looking at your monitor, or you're listening to this discussion on your iPad or your Android, I encourage you to think about where do these products come from? And I could probably say 9 out of 10 of you on the call that most of your products were probably manufactured in the Chinese production network. And that is, your computer chair, your computer monitor, perhaps your phone that you're using to listen to this discussion, your headphones, your coffee cup from Starbucks is probably from China, and a lot of other things that we really take for granted. And the reason why I say that is it's important for us to understand that so many different products from our ordinary lives are actually produced in the Chinese-based global production network. And because of that, a disruption in the Chinese global production network has global ramifications. So we can generally break down this into a couple different areas. We can call them low-value items. So that could be anything from plastic cups to children toys to goods that we use to mow our lawn or cut our hair. So that would be kind of a low-value items that are disrupted in supply chains. The middle-value areas are things like our computers or things like our iPhones or electronics. And why I say they're middle value is because they're quite ubiquitous in terms of access. We all have them. And even in emerging countries, you have access to these kinds of technologies. And as a result, they are really, they're everywhere. So those items are also disrupted. Probably the next level is what we call the dual-use items. So dual-use items could be semiconductors. They could be certain kinds of computers. And those as well are based in the China-based production network. They're a little bit more complicated. in that the semiconductors that are used for our phones and our iPads and our computers, our jet planes, our fighter planes, and our cars, they're manufactured by the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company. So that is a somewhat of a distinction. So those are the three, I guess, types of broad categories that I think are useful for understanding supply chains and what's being supplied in these chains. Now, in terms of disruption, which I think is really important for us to be thinking about, there are what we call acute disruptions and then chronic disruptions. So, or we can think about this in terms of structural disruptions. So the acute disruptions would be best described as things like the COVID-19 pandemic, which have shut down with the shutdown of Chinese cities like Shanghai or Suzhou or Beijing or other cities in China. These one-time shutdowns have effects on the supplies that will be coming to us. And right now, we should expect a significant delay in many products that were built in the Shanghai area in the next 3 to 6 months. And that's going to have an increase, or that's going to affect how inflation works in all our countries. So get ready for more expensive iPads or slower iPads and iPhones and other objects being delivered to your markets in your part of the world. So those kind of more unpredictable events, this is something that we'll always deal with and that will always affect prices. We also have more chronic issues, so issues related to prices related to geopolitical changes. Those are concerns that I think we all are affecting the supply chains. We also have both the weaponization and monopolization of supply chains associated with geopolitics, and we've seen that, for example, with Australia, where the Chinese government has really shut off their market to Australian products, or some Australian products like barley or wine or meats, while keeping their market open to other products such as iron ore. So this is a geopolitically related disruption in the supply chains. We also have disruptions in supply chains associated with the explicit choices of governments. And here, I think the lockdown in Shanghai and Beijing are very good examples of that kind of choice by a government to to shut down a part of their economy that will have downstream effects on the economy. And lastly, and something that I think most of us are watching in terms of disruptions on supply chains, of course, is the conflict in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I think it's pretty fair to say it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainians haven't invaded Russia, has disrupted food supplies. It will disrupt some energy supplies. And I think going forward, because of the sanctions on Russia, we're going to see growing disruptions on nickel supplies, energy supplies, natural resources, some critical minerals. And this is going to also affect the supply of everything from cars to microchips to energy environmentally friendly car batteries, because many of those products are built from Russian-based products. So we see a disruption in supply chains based in China, but we also see disruptions outside China that are affecting the global supply chains and, of course, affecting our everyday lives. And I think it's important for us to be thinking about supply chain disruptions from many different levels. Moving forward, I assume that things like climate change will disrupt supply chains. And let's think about food and food security in Southeast Asia as climate change continues, and I'm a believer in climate change, that sea levels will rise. We'll see the salinization of the Mekong Delta, and this will fundamentally disrupt the food source for millions and millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of Southeast Asians, and of course the countries that are the benefactors of the agricultural exports that emerge from the Mekong Delta. The same can be said for Bangladesh, as the Bangladeshi Delta, as well as parts of India. So we will see food supply chains being disrupted because of climate change. And this is something that will have fundamental effects and be disruptive, not just on the economies that are affected directly by the climate change, but the downstream benefactors of the exports of those countries. We see the same with disruption of water supplies, and this is related to mostly climate change, but also competition for water in different parts of the world. And here, I think Southeast Asia is probably most affected by the water supply and water games associated with the damming of the Mekong in the northern part of Southeast Asia and parts of China. So when we think about supply chains, it's useful to think about in terms of technology, in terms of food, in terms of energy, in terms of low-value products, mid-value products, and dual-use products. And this partly explains why we're seeing inflation all around the world, where this is partly explains why you have to wait for 1 year or 2 years to get a car. And I was just in Europe, and many of my friends said it takes 2 years to buy a car now because they can't get the parts for the electronics that are based in vehicles today. So I think it's important to look at these issues from a lot of different fields and areas. Lastly, I'd like to just touch upon the ways that countries are responding to the concerns about supply chains. And here, I think there's a lot of different responses. And one of the responses is unilateral. So we see countries like Japan adopting special budgets in which they can reshore some of the essential industries that they would like to ensure that are back home in the archipelago of Japan. This, of course, is no perfect solution, and there's no way to replace the Chinese market for Japan. So that is an example. The second example is, of course, working multilaterally or within small minilateral groups, and the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative between India, Australia, and Japan is another good example. So they've agreed to build alternative supply chains. That's not replacing China, and I think this is really, really important for us to re-emphasize or emphasize. There's no replacing China, but the view is that it's critical to create some alternatives so that not all the supply chain eggs are in the same basket. And what that means is that if there's another geopolitical factor stressing relations in the Chinese context, or there's another conflict around the world, such as the invasion of Ukraine, that countries will be able to absorb, or other regions will be able to absorb some of the shock to the system. So here we see countries like Japan working with other countries to build some selectively diverse supply chains in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And this will continue. Interesting enough, you can see this happening in Central and Eastern Europe as well. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I think some Eastern European countries and Central European countries will be benefactors of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as companies will move more to Central and Eastern Europe in terms of producing products that are for the local European market. We also see some bigger projects, and I think the Quad's announcement on talking about supply chains and infrastructure and connectivity after the recent Tokyo summit is also another good example of the kinds of cooperation that's going on to build more resilience into the supply chain network at many different levels. Now, the Quad being what we call a mini-lateral agreement is, of course, between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States are thinking about how they can work together to build more resilience into supply chains. Now, they are not thinking about this just in terms of working together, but they're also thinking how other countries can work with other countries to complement their initiatives to build more resilience into the supply chain. So I think these are some really interesting ways to be thinking about how countries are thinking about more resilience into the supply chain. But we also see other, I think, important agreements. For example, the America Build Back Better Act, or America Competes Act, are both essentially trying to reshore some industries so that the United States can be more resilient against shocks to their economic system, while at the same time trying to build the so-called foreign policy and domestic policy for the middle class. So we have a lot of different initiatives that are trying to build more resilience into supply chains, and those initiatives really are working with so-called like-minded countries. I think it's also important to think about this in terms of what is China's responses to thinking about resilient supply chains. And they are as well engaging in a process of selectively diversifying away from Western countries, of trying to build resilience into their supply chain network, and trying to build some asymmetric dependency between countries on the BRI. And I think that this is an important point for us to make about China as well, as they're also interested in increasing their resilience to Western sanctions, to Western pressure, to the dominance of Western markets. And I think the response by the United States, the EU countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others to the Russian invasion has demonstrated how important it is for China to double down on its own process of building resilience into its economy and into supply chains and into the group of countries that it's working with. It's doing this through the dual circulation strategy about diversifying its international partners, but also trying to boost domestic consumption. But it's also proactively thinking about how it can build more robustness and resilience into what I think many Chinese perceive as future possible sanctions and economic pressure against the Chinese market in the case of some kind of conflict. So the strategies to develop more supply chain resilience is not just coming from China, it's not Japan, the United States and Western countries. China as well is developing a system. So just to review, again, I think it's important to think about the different supply chains that exist and the kinds of how they impact our lives. Second is to again be thinking about the importance of these supply chains, and lastly to be thinking about how we're responding. And different countries are responding differently to those supply chain issues, but again, they're all interested in building more resilience into the system. So with that, I'm going to stop there and then open up the floor to comments and questions and learning from all of you.
Thank you, Stephen. The first and the most important step is actually building resilience into the supply chains. And as you mentioned, different countries are dealing with this challenge in different ways. So I would like to hear Eleanor about this, because probably I believe that, Eleanor, you have some insights on this too. If you can talk now, let's go on.
Sure. Thank you, Maya, for letting me have the stage, as well as Stephen. It's great to chat with you both after a little hiatus of some sort. Yeah, happy Monday, or I guess happy Monday evening for some of you. But it's only 7:19 a.m. here in Washington, so I'm literally just waking up and starting a whole new week. So first off, I am in Washington, and I will also shamelessly promote some stuff going on, such as today, the Asia Society, which I'm actually working at for the summer. We are hosting Ambassador Catherine Tai, who's the U.S. Trade Representative. She is going to be speaking with Wendy Cutler, who's the Managing Director of Asia Society's DC office. She'll be talking about IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the Biden administration's trade agenda. For any of you who are interested, it is in person. You have to pay for it, but for most of you, since I'm assuming you're not in DC, you can stream on Zoom for free. It's from 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. I'll see if after I stop speaking, if I can share the link in some way for those who are interested.
Thank you.
Of course. So with that, I think there are lots of things going on, as Stephen mentioned, and not just within the Indo-Pacific countries, but that of the United States as well. Lots of debates, first of all, about, what happened because of the pandemic. First of all, that I would call that pandemic a black swan incident, because that's obviously something that was unanticipated. And I think one of the natures of an acute disruption, as Stephen mentioned, is that it is quite unanticipated. And then the chronic disruptions are more what I would, or Michelle Walker actually labeled it as a gray rhino situation. So I think those are terms that I've used in the previous time. So for anybody who's wants to learn new terms today, there you are. Second of all, I think Stephen is very much on point about how the Quad, how emerging tech and supply chain resiliency has been featured more prominently in these mini-laterals, or the Quad, for example. I think that especially in the United States since COVID-19, and even more so in a different way because of Ukraine's invasion, Americans are very much concerned about inflation. I went back to Indiana and just came back to DC a few days ago. I've never seen gas prices at nearly $5 in the Midwest in my hometown before. That was quite astonishing, to say the least. And the fact is that DC is actually not that much different from a gas pricing standpoint from Indiana, which I find both alarming and kind of freaky at the same time. So there's that. And I think one thing that I really should talk about, because I'm in DC, is the IPEF. That was something that the Biden administration formally launched in Tokyo a few weeks back. And, even in DC, there's quite a bit of conversations as to what is going on with IPEF. What is the nature of IPEF? What kind of deliverables will it provide that perhaps the U.S. joining TPP can't, or can, I guess? Because I think, generally speaking, for those who are Asia watchers in DC, still prefer the U.S. joining TPP, or what's now called CPTPP, over IPEF. And I do feel bad for my friends who are proponents of IPEF, or who have worked closely with the launching of IPEF, because they know this very much. But at the very least, I think one of the issues with IPEF for a lot of people, and I'll let Stephen agree or disagree with me here, is that it doesn't provide market access in the way that TPP would have. And that's something that's quite frustrating to watchers here, even in DC. And I think another issue, just because it's garnered so many headlines, not just when Biden was in Japan, but even well before that, is the fact that Taiwan is not part of IPEF. But not that long after IPEF was launched, the U.S. Government did announce some sort of initiative in which it would have with Taiwan. The nature of what that would entail is yet to be seen, and whether or not Taiwan not being a part of IPEF, but being a part of this bilateral framework is better in the long run, is still something that is quite debated on. I think the last thing I'll touch on is on Stephen's third bucket about how countries are responding. And at least in the US, I think because of COVID-19, we've noticed that, like any other country, we need to bring back a lot of our, the administration saying, like, especially with semiconductors and other critical technologies that cannot be easily replicated, that the manufacturing should be brought into the US. And I think one big debate going on is whether or not the current or any future administration should fortify and employ what is called a strategic industrial policy, or you can just call it an industrial policy. And that's something that I think is really starting to be talked about. The Biden administration, when Blinken had his speech with Asia policy a few weeks ago at George Washington University, did say that the Biden administration is working and laying the groundwork for a strategic industrial policy. Some people have hesitations over that, particularly proponents of free market, because that would mean that the government would conspicuously take a bigger role in shaping the economic activity in the United States. And that could, of course, favor certain industries that are deemed critical for the purpose of national security, which a big case in point, I think, is well known is semiconductors and AI, quantum computing, et cetera. And as someone I know from ITIF has said, potato chips and computer chips are not exactly the same thing. And, one reason perhaps for not, to have a strategic industrial policy is because, if you don't have one, any industry could then say, well, we are strategic for national security purposes as well. But obviously, as COVID-19 and other anomalies have shown us, that's not entirely the same thing. So I think going forward, for anybody who's interested in looking at from wherever you're at, whether or not your own country should fortify a strategic industrial policy, I'd take a look at the very least at a few things, one being the part I just mentioned about whether or not the supply chain, the final product itself, along with especially the final product itself, can it be easily replicated if you continue to diversify the supply chains? And something I've mentioned in a previous Clubhouse event is the human talent component. And that's something that I think until recently has only garnered attention in DC. I think DC, in my opinion, has been a little late to the game, and really noticing that human talent is something that personally can not only be easily replicated, but something that really should be championing. And as something that Blinken did say that I'm quite happy about is the fact that, at least in the United States, there's so much foreign talent. That is the reason behind why America has technological leadership globally. And he also did say that, that is also, he gave quite a bit of credit to Chinese international students. And one of the advantages that the United States has is not only attracting talent, but retaining talent. And I think that's something that China is also trying to do as well through their 1,000 Talents program. Maybe if Chao-Ting knows more about it, he could enlighten us further. But those are some of my comments. So love to hear what others have to say. Thank you so much, as always.
Thanks, Eleanor. And this is why I like Clubhouse. A lot of smart people are on the call. And, Eleanor's much younger than me, but she speaks like someone that's been in the trenches for a long time.
You are far too kind, Steve. I don't know if I deserve that comment, but you're so kind.
So I know Chao-Ting's in the call, but I know Margaret is also in the room as well, and she's a former, what do we call it, a reformed diplomat? Is that how we say it, Margaret? So I think in Canada she might be able to provide some interesting comments as well in terms of where Canada fits in terms of supply chains and how Canada is part or not part of IPEF. But I do think that your comment about IPEF is interesting, and I think IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is a good start. Where it will be in 5 years from now is what we should be looking at rather than what was announced last week in Tokyo. But I do think Eleanor's point about not having market access is a point of criticism about IPEF. But at the same time, I think it's really important for us to be understanding that I think trade in general is not moving towards access, but rather standard formation. And I think that this is something that we really need to be thinking about is, can we be part of the standard setting process, and how will this benefit us or not in terms of our economies? Access, I don't think we're moving towards a period where we are thinking about opening up our economies anymore to trade. And this is something that really I think is important for us to be thinking about. Second, I want to touch upon that broader theme of minilaterals. And I think the kinds of cooperation that's going on right now through minilateral relationships, such as the Quad, such as AUKUS, even expanded reciprocal access agreements, as well as the TPP and IPEF, really I think are the way forward. There's an understanding that large groupings of countries coming together to talk about trade, well, on paper sound great, but to find compromise with 20 or 30 or 40 or 190 countries on standards on trade is something that's not possible anymore. And that means if you want to change the direction of trade, or standard setting that you're going to have to work with a smaller group of countries. And this will either slow globalization towards globalization, or we may see a push towards deglobalization, in that we're going to see the balkanization of trade, balkanization of supply chains, and balkanization of standards that will be really interesting to watch in the years to come. And I think that, again, there will be winners here and losers here, and I'm not sure if IPEF will be a part of that process. But I'd sure love to bring in Margaret on this to hear what she has to say.
Okay, terrific. I'm just getting used to the configuration of this particular platform. So nice to be with you. Thanks, Stephen, for inviting me into the chat. And you know, I've been saying in Canada that we should be part of the IPEF. And in fact, our Indo-Pacific strategy should be announced imminently. It was expected back in February or so, and then there's been a delay. It's not clear why. And but I would hope and expect that when the strategy itself is announced, that we'll also say that we're joining IPEF. That would make a lot of sense. But you know, I think we also need to be looking as a nation at the Quad and AUKUS, both of which I think we could engage with on a technology platform. They each have technology working groups, and Canada has strengths in the areas that they have laid out as their technology interests. So I think we could contribute on that front as well.
Thanks, Margaret. I fully agree. I think that in particular, looking at AUKUS, on the AI part, quantum computing part, and cybersecurity part, I think Canada does have world-class institutions that can contribute to these sides of AUKUS. However, that will take political leadership and a commitment to the Indo-Pacific with a clear policy that at this stage we haven't articulated, at least Ottawa hasn't articulated. And that has made us not the first choice, not the second choice of partners in the Indo-Pacific region, but not a choice at all. And it's a big concern to see Canada being marginalized this way.
I agree. And on top of the 3.5-year delay on the Huawei decision, this is really, in my mind, almost a national embarrassment that there have been such delays. Our Indo-Pacific strategy was started back in November 2019. That's when work on it began. And, you know, it's long overdue for announcement. And I hope we'll be seeing it soon. I hope that it will be a detailed strategy, not a lightweight strategy. And I hope that it will also identify how we see our role with China, the new, more aggressive China that we've been seeing play out with the Michaels and so on. And so there are a lot of expectations for this, and I hope they don't disappoint.
Thanks, Margaret. I guess we're on the same page of the book. I was hoping for some controversy with you, but not tonight. In terms of supply chains, where does Canada fit in, Margaret? Do you have any views?
Well, you know, I think we need to be looking more at the countries that are neighboring China, because we've seen that supply chains that are dependent on China are not reliable. And so countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, we need to be more engaged with them on supply chains. And, you know, we can be part of that as well. You know, rare earths is something that Canada actually has and is critical in the semiconductor industry. So that's an area where we can actually contribute importantly.
I agree with that a lot, and I think that energy security, critical minerals is another area that Canada can add value in terms of those particular supply chains and building more resilience, but more predictability and stability. I see Chao Ting on the call. Chao Ting, do you want to jump in? And it's good to see you again.
Good evening, Stephen. Yeah, thank you very much for this discussion. I understand today's topic is about the supply chain. I think there are already a lot of intensive discussions about the global supply chain. I think the global supply chain is one product of globalization. So today we are talking about COVID-19 and the resilient supply chain. But I think if we want to understand these problems, we have to have a big picture of globalization. So I would like to record the process of globalization since the end of World War II. I think after the end of World War II, there was a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the world is divided into two blocks. That time there was also globalization. I would like to call it globalization 1.0, but it's limited within Western Europe, North America, and Japan. So inside the liberal or free world, there is something of globalization. And then after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have seen this globalization 2.0. And this is truly globalization. I think China has joined this wave of globalization and has benefited from globalization or not. Maybe China is the biggest beneficiary of globalization 2.0, but Russia is a loser. And as far as I remember, the Russia strategist Alexander Dugin has made it very clear: Russia is a loser of globalization 2.0. And I think the difference between China and Russia is very enormous. And I think China has joined the globalization 2.0, and China has become the so-called workshop of the world, right? So, and China is playing very important role in the global supply chain. China is producing almost everything for multinational companies such as Apple and some other companies like Siemens, Daimler-Benz. Okay, so this is the example. But now we have seen probably globalization 3.0 because the current rules-based liberal international order has been broken. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the rise of China has posed great challenges to the U.S. dominated rules-based international order. So I think the decision makers in Washington and Brussels and Tokyo are thinking about the restructuring of the globalization. Of course, the consequence can be seen in global supply chain. So in the past, China is one part of the global supply chain, but now the situation has changed. Russia and China are increasingly regarded as strategic competitors of the Western countries, including Japan as well. So I think the decision makers, political and economic elites, are considering to change the current global supply chain as a result of the change of the global geopolitical situation. So what will be the consequence? Yeah, I agree. This is not a containment against China. Instead, it's the diversification of global supply chain. It's about reduce reliance on Russia and China. We have seen after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the European countries have made the decision to reduce the reliance of energy on Russia's supply, especially oil supply. They will reduce the reliance to zero. Okay, for gas, it's a different story, but they have also made one plan to reduce its supply on Russia. So for China, I think the same story is happening, but not so powerful as the sanctions against Russia right now, because China is still one part of the global supply chain, and China has not violated the rule with military force. Okay, so the progress is much slower than the sanctions against Russia, but it's happening. It's happening. We have seen the restructure of global supply chain. The multinational companies are relocating their factories from China to other South Asia and Southeast Asia countries, especially India and Vietnam. And some multinational companies are leaving China. For example, Amazon has closed its Kindle business in China, and Microsoft has closed its LinkedIn in China. So if we want to understand the change of global supply chain, we have to have a bigger picture about the change of the globalization. For me, it's the third wave of the globalization since the end of World War II. So this time, the globalization will be stronger within the countries, within the like-minded countries. For example, we have seen Indo-Pacific economic framework. I think the intention of the U.S. is to strengthen the economic connection between like-minded countries. Okay, so they want to reduce the reliance on China, especially in some strategically important sectors like semiconductor. Okay, so I think this is my observation. If we want to understand the restructure of the global supply chain, then we have to understand the global geopolitical situation, especially its impacts on globalization. So this is my observation. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaoting. I think that's really insightful, and you provide a really good, I guess, continuum of where we've been and possibly where we're going. And again, some of the drivers of the new form of globalization. You say globalization 3.0. I think some of us talk about it in terms of globalization or deglobalization or the balkanization of global supply chains and trade. But the pattern is clear, as you outlined, is that we're going to see growing like-minded countries form unilateral or coalitions of trading and supply chain partners. And I guess the question maybe I have for you is, how does China respond to this? Do you think that they are also are building their own IPEF, or whatever you want to call it, China-Pacific Economic Framework, as an alternative towards the initiatives coming out of the United States and like-minded countries?
Yeah, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy, including the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is a very serious threat for the Chinese government. They treated the movement very seriously, I think. So, in order to respond to the new geopolitical and geoeconomic change, the Chinese government is also busy with some response. For example, you have mentioned dual circulation.
Yes.
Dual circulation, I think, is a very important strategy for Chinese government as a response to U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the Chinese decision makers want to enhance the domestic market. This is number one. Number two, many scholars and experts are discussing about Chinese version of globalization. This means China will reduce its reliance on Western countries, especially the United States. China will push for its own globalization. Probably this is a BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. This means China will enhance its economic connection with other developing countries. They believe China has advantage in these countries. China can make a huge contribution to the economic development of these poor countries because China has capital, China has technology. Most importantly, China has experience of economic development economic development in these poor countries, because before 1978, China was actually also very poor. So China believes China's experience and models are probably more suitable for these third world developing countries than Western model, Washington consensus. For Chinese scholars and experts, Washington consensus has failed, and more and more developing countries are turning to China. China has offered an alternative model for Washington consensus. So I think this is very likely that China will enhance its domestic market and the economic expansion in developing countries. In the past, the U.S. market, European market are very important destination of Chinese products. But now, I think China will invest more resources in its own domestic market and developing countries. Therefore, BRI will be strengthened rather than weakened. This is my understanding.
Well, that's interesting. Because my general sense is the BRI is not so much a supply chain network, and that the comparative advantages of the BRI are declining because of competition, because of more awareness of the shortcomings of the BRI, and frankly, the Chinese economy has huge structural issues, and the current choices by Xi Jinping and his leadership are further slowing down the economy in an attempt to try and control the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's really interesting. I have many questions if the BRI is a feasible way to achieve Chinese interests for one, and if there is equivalence in terms of, I think, U.S. and other countries' alternative supply chain initiatives.
It's true. It's true. BRI has a lot of problems and challenges, and many people are doubting the usefulness of BRI. And right now, Chinese domestic economy has a lot of problem. It's true, but let's look at the situation, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What choice does China have? China has no choice. More and more people perceive U.S. as one enemy, and I don't think the U.S. is the enemy of China, but more and more Chinese people, including decision makers, are perceiving U.S. and its Western airlines as enemy of China. They want to contain China's development. So China has no choice but to work together with Russia and other developing countries. Russia is economically weak, so Russia can be China's airlines from strategic perspective. But economically, Russia cannot help China. The developing countries can be the big market for Chinese products, and China is doing this, is implementing this strategy. In the past, the Chinese foreign exchange has been invested in U.S. debt. I think U.S. debt, but now China are investing more and more foreign exchange into BRI projects. So I think China has not too much choice but to work together with Russia and developing countries. Therefore, they have to enhance their investment in BRI projects. What can they do? So if they lose the market of the Western countries, if the geopolitical tension between China and the U.S. is intensified, okay, they have no choice.
Again, I'd love to hear other people's voices on this particular question, because I think I've written about this. I think the tilt towards Russia was the wrong strategic move, but it was related to Xi Jinping's political weakness rather than political strength, and that he could have tilted towards the United States and the West. That doesn't mean disavow Russia, but try to maintain the market with the so-called Western world. But yeah, I'd love to hear other people's views on this and how it's related to supply chains.
This division of the world, which we are observing at the moment, I am afraid that it is going to continue, and it is going to create even larger gaps between countries with different ideologies. And we have seen this. I mean, as you said, Stephen, China could have just chosen to lean towards the United States, but it chose to lean towards Russia. And of course, we cannot actually we cannot ignore the fact that there is an ideological stimulus for China to do that. And one thing which is really bothering me as a person, well, or of course as somebody who has been following your articles and other people's articles as well, is that this division is going to only increase. Hopefully, you're not going to end up, having wars between the different smaller groups of countries. But I don't know. What do you think are the ways, to deal with this?
Let's hear from some of our participants, Eleanor or Chao-Ting or Margaret or Federico F. or others. Margaret's on. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yes, I wasn't surprised by the deal with Russia or the new strategic partnership with Russia. Xi Jinping has been demonizing the U.S. For many reasons, but primarily for to raise nationalism within China around a common enemy. And we know that his objective is to become a superpower above the United States, with economic strength greater than the United States. And so this all plays into his demonization, I guess, of the U.S. economy and the U.S. military for nationalistic purposes. And so NATO, of course, with U.S. membership, becomes an enemy. And I'm sure he's surprised by how things have gone in Ukraine, and is looking at that very closely, especially as it might relate to how things might go with Taiwan. I think one of the fallouts of this in China-Russia relations is that my understanding is that China was going to use the Russia's chairmanship of the Arctic Council to try to become a full member itself. And now the Arctic Council is not meeting because no one wants to sit in the same room as Russia. And so that has been thwarted. So that's my view of it.
Yeah, the choice has now put China in a very difficult place, because in some ways it's seen as a facilitator of the invasion of the Ukraine, in that it's really hard to believe that Xi didn't understand that this was going to happen. That didn't mean that he had to give permission to the Russians to do what they did, but it really seems like they understood that this was going to happen, and that really puts it makes us look at China differently in terms of their leadership and how wedded they are to those principles of five principles of peaceful coexistence, if they can overlook their ally or their closest partner invading a sovereign state. But again, I want to pull this discussion back to the idea of supply chains, and is this feasible? Is it feasible to create alternative supply chains from China's standpoint, which I don't think it is personally. Being an export-based economy, it has no more flexibility to pivot away from the global economy than the Japanese have pivoting away from the global economy. So in a sense, how can they build resilience into their supply chain network? And how will that affect how so-called like-minded countries are building resilience into their supply chain network? And here, maybe Eleanor, you can jump in and share some of your views, because this is really an interesting aspect of this supply chain resilience process, is that both societies or both groups are building resilience into the supply chains, and will they become incompatible, or what will be the direction of their the development of these supply chains?
Sure, I can insert some comments here. I did mention earlier about how within the U.S.-China technological competition that the competition over talent has become more prominent.
Yeah.
And and I think to answer your question about how is China itself going to really maintain resiliency in its own economy and its own supply chains, I think talent is one part of it, because of not just because of the 1,000 Talents program, where they're trying to attract their own talent that went abroad back to come back to return to China, as well as foreign talent to study and stay in China as well. But in recent months, one thing that I've looked at somewhat closely is how Taiwan has taken note of this, and the Taiwanese government has become quite alarmed by this. In 2020, the government established, I think within their Ministry of Justice, some sort of task force that allows them to raid Chinese suppliers, and that's something they've done at least a few times, I think March and April. And that is something that I think is only going to happen more and more, as the Taiwanese, they're no longer allowing recruiting, some sort of staffing and recruiting within the mainland, because they are very much afraid of IP theft or stealing of IP, and China somehow, taking their own talent away to China. And at the same time, Taiwan, of course, they house one of the most important semiconductor companies, TSMC, in the world. And that also is very important for not just for the purpose of the Taiwan as a flashpoint, but for the global semiconductor supply chain itself. So I think, they're facing a severe talent shortage as well. And I think, in Washington, one thing that I'm a little sad that hasn't really taken over so many conversations yet is some of the stuff that, U.S. universities have taken, such as Purdue University, which is actually where my sister just graduated from. So shamelessly plugging Purdue here for the moment, but why not? but they actually were the first school to create a whole master's program for semiconductors. And that's something that I hope will increase in the United States, especially among what we call the Big Ten schools, that have very good engineering programs, because this supply chain issue we're talking about now, but this isn't just a now problem, this is a years problem, and it's going to take years and generations of talent within the United States, within like-minded countries. And if you're looking at China's perspective too, I guess it's going to take China generations as well for it to feel, to have the sense that their supply chains and their economy in general is resilient. So I think the human talent is a huge area and space worth looking at going forward, not just for the semiconductor industry too, that's just the industry that I happen to look at, but increasingly vying for talent is something that is only not a now problem, but it's a generations issue. And for anybody who's interested in looking into this issue or space further, Brookings Institution and CSIS just recently started a podcast literally called Vying for Talent. The first person they did interview was Morris Chang, the TSMC chairman or former chairman, whatever. But anyways, yeah, that podcast might be worth listening to for anybody interested in this space. I hope that kind of answers your question, Stephen.
It's a super comment. And I think we're talking about supply chains, we're talking about the goods being transferred, but we rarely talk about individuals and, as you say, human talent or human capacity being translated or transported through supply chains, and how they are related to making supply chains more resilient. And this is, I think, a critical area that we're going to be further stressed by moving forward. And now that borders are opening up, there's really open questions of, will people come back? Will they have the same patterns of immigration or migration, and how will this affect those precious industries like the semiconductor industry? And of course, where does the talent go? And as you touched upon Taiwan, and you touched upon China in terms of pulling talent in, and Taiwan trying to keep the talent. There's really open questions as to how long these supply chains will be sustainable if one country or the other is more successful at recruiting these talents.
Yeah, and since you also talked about, we're not just coexisting with COVID, but we're really also, people here in Washington, we're still very hybrid oriented. But for semiconductors, for example, unlike software engineering, it's so hard for the semiconductor industry, because even before the pandemic, people didn't work remotely, whereas like with software engineering, you kind of can. And even before COVID, the consulting industry, the finance industry, they've had been doing a better job incentivizing employees to, join their respective companies and also stay, whether it be for like benefits, higher salaries, etc. That's something that, at the very least, I can speak for the U.S. semiconductor industry, I think is kind of falling behind in. And as we integrate, make our way back into working in person, I'm sure in many other countries, but at the very least in the U.S., when employers tell them that, like, hey, you have to come in 5 days a week, there's so many people who are like, I'd actually rather submit a resignation letter and join some other company where I don't have to go in 5 days a week than to stay with you. And going forward, it'll be interesting to see just how, beyond the need for talent in the semiconductor industry, what kind of creative ways can the semiconductor industry find creative ways to incentivize their employees to stay, particularly if they can't work hybrid, for example. So there are a lot of things that are worth figuring out, not just within the technological competition, but thinking about how we acclimate, or how the people in the semiconductor industry reacclimate to themselves to working in person. So those are big issues as well.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do if I have to go back to university 5 days
Exactly.
a week.
Exactly.
I'm happy to teach remotely, but I think there's also a real place for face-to-face contact, and I would much rather do Clubhouse with all of you in person. But this is the next best thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, let's pivot back to thinking about supply chains from the viewpoint of, where do you guys see, let's say, technology supply chains migrating, and what are some of the pressure points over the next 5 or 10 years? And are we ready for a disruption? And again, there's lots of people on the call, so let's hear from Margaret or Chatting or Eleanor or Maya or any of the others that are on the call. I see Lan is also on the call from Vietnam.
Yes, Stephen, I want to add one point.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we are talking about supply chain. This is fundamentally an economic issue. But if we are talking about an economic issue, we cannot ignore the importance of politics, especially geopolitics. I think politics is more important than economics life. Let's take China as one example. In 1972, President Richard Nixon has visited China, and then the relationship between China and the U.S. Has been improved. And then China has joined the globalization and has benefited from globalization and has changed our world tremendously. That's the evidence that politics has changed economics. So the global division of neighbor or the so-called global supply chain is actually the result of the geopolitics. Right. So I think now the geopolitics has changed or not. Many people are talking about new Cold War 2.0. Yeah, probably it's not a Cold War, but we cannot ignore the huge geopolitical change, particularly between U.S. and China. So under such a circumstance, the global economics will be impacted and changed as well. Absolutely. So we have seen changes in both sides. I mean, in the U.S.-led Western countries and China, Russia, Iran, we are seeing change in both sides. The U.S. is trying to restructure the global supply chain, diversification or resilience, whatever. It's changing. So the cooperation between like-minded countries will be enhanced. And on the China-Russia side, we are seeing change as well. Russia has no choice but to turn to China. Russian economy has been decoupled from Western countries. So Russia has no choice but to work together with China. And China has not too many choice as well. So China will enhance its cooperation with Russia and the third world countries through BRI. So I think the changes are taking place in both sides. So this is very important for us if we want to understand today's world.
Yeah, I think you're right. Actually, I think we're moving in increasingly an area that it's increasingly difficult to understand the direction of today's world, and part of it's driven by politics, as you've mentioned. Part of it's driven by the black swan events that Eleanor mentioned, and part of it's driven by the pressures of COVID, which has pushed many countries to be more inward-looking. And that includes not only China, but also Canada, and I think United States and Australia and others. So there's a lot of pressures pushing the trajectory of bilateral relations and the world in different directions. And I would, at least in my point of view, I just don't know if I can say for certain that we're going in any particular direction except a negative one. Margaret, I see that you're unmiked.
Yes, thanks. In my own research, I've been looking at technology joint ventures in China and the ways in which foreign companies have lost their IP and in some cases lost the entire joint venture to their Chinese partner. And I've been advising Canadian companies that if they are too heavily invested in China, they should reduce their risk and move out to other countries in the region. The one that people most focus on is Vietnam, and I think it's been very successful in attracting foreign companies. And for example, South Korea, in its new Southern policy, it is particularly focused on Vietnam. There's been some suggestion that it should refocus on some other countries in the region. I'm wondering what effect this is having on Vietnam relations with China. That's something that I haven't looked at, and perhaps others on the call have looked at that dynamic in more detail.
Margaret, that's a very interesting question and point you made about Vietnam, because I think Apple is also diversifying its supply chains, I think, towards Vietnam, specifically for iPads. I may have to double look that up late after this call. But I think for Vietnam, if I remember correctly, I mean, Vietnam, I don't want to pivot too far away from the supply chain stuff, but I think out of the Southeast Asia countries, I think Vietnam is less hesitant about, I guess, upsetting or making China frustrated, because also Vietnam is one of the littoral states that's involved in the South China Sea maritime dispute, and China has also historically and still even now encroached in some of these countries' exclusive economic zones, island reclamation activities. You have it. So I think part of your question can be answered by China's behavior, not just within the supply chain conversation that we're having here, but its other activities within the region, such as the South China Sea dispute. I think to your point, it will be very interesting to see from a more U.S. perspective what that will mean for U.S.-Vietnam bilateral relations going forward, as well as, Canada. I don't know much about Canada to the extent that you and Stephen do, but it will be very interesting to see going forward if Vietnam becomes more of a hub for supply chains within the technology realm. I think that will be a very interesting pivot and a very interesting space worth looking at.
Well, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Melanie Joly, went to Vietnam and Indonesia last month as a prelude to tabling the new Indo-Pacific strategy in the House of Commons. She was to do that on her return, but hasn't done that yet. And the day after she left Vietnam, Wang Yi called his counterpart in Vietnam to point out to him in firm terms that Indo-Pacific strategies are divisive, and Indo-Pacific strategies are being used to gang up on China. So that was quite a message for Wang Yi to deliver. I don't know the extent to which that message was received well in Vietnam, unlikely, but certainly it's been noticed in Canada. And so, it's concerning if China is targeting efforts to broaden and deepen Canada's relations in the region by choosing to chew out our potential partners there.
Excuse me, in terms of Vietnam, yesterday I have read one article written by Chinese economic experts. They are also discussing the importance of Vietnam very intensively. And they have noticed the transfer from China to Vietnam. But their evaluation is a little bit different. So I would like to mention their opinion. According to these Chinese experts, economic experts, probably Vietnam is an alternative destination for many multinational companies, but Vietnam is not a peer competitor of China because Vietnam is too small from their perspective. The current GDP of Vietnam is just 2% of China, 2%, as many as one city in China. So probably some multinational companies will transfer their production from China to Vietnam, but they are not worried about the likelihood that Vietnam will take over China. This is impossible. But India can be another alternative. India is big, right? So India has 1.4 billion people. But the problem of India is that the infrastructure of India is quite poor, and they are not a peer competitor of China. So, and it takes a long time for India to improve its infrastructure. India has very strong software industry, but software industry cannot employ many people. So in order to compete against China, India must have very strong manufacturing industry. It takes a long time. So, but whatever, I think the restructure of supply chain is sending a warning signal to Chinese decision makers. So they are watching the situation very closely. I think we are thinking about the response or the solution. But from Chinese perspective, Vietnam is not a threat.
Yeah, I would like to just touch upon that with Chao Ting and the group before we end tonight's discussion. And I always ask my friends on these kinds of calls and discussions, how many of you celebrate Christmas or New Year's or Orthodox or Valentine's or any of these? And I think all of you should be raising your hand. And most of the stuff that we give away during that period is built by Chinese. They come to work in August, July, and they spend the next 6 or 7 months building all our Christmas presents. That's 300 or 400 million people moving into the manufacturing sector. And then about, January or February, depending when Chinese New Year's is, they move back. Until we have a solution to replace 300 or 400 million people moving into the manufacturing sector and those supply chains, China is the only game in town. They're the only game in town, not just because of numbers. For 40 years, they've built logistic pathways. They've reduced their costs. They have complementary business ecosystems that work with each other. They have a relatively compliant workforce. And they have that one great thing that most other countries don't have, an authoritarian government that makes it happen. So these are issues that I think over the long term are even not replaceable if we develop all of Southeast Asia and South Asia. They're kind of comparative advantages. In that sense, I don't think China worries about most of those supply chains migrating away from China. But the high-tech ones, they certainly do. And this is the area that I think most the so-called like-minded countries are concentrating on, of how they can migrate the high-tech supply chains away from China, and how can they continue to do business with China. And that's the magic formula. And I don't think anybody has got that right, but that's the magic formula that the Chinese would like to prevent from happening, and that's the magic formula that I think American Competes Act and the Japanese economic security policies and the Indo-Pacific policies that are emerging out of different countries are trying to realize. And it's not an easy situation because of all those factors I mentioned. And with that, supply chains are going to continue to be wedded to the Chinese market because of cost, because of their comparative advantages. But on the tech side, this is a very interesting question. Where do we go? And how will the selective diversification of technology supply chains affect Chinese development, as well as affect standard setting and affect how we think about technology?
Thank you very much, Stephen and Eleanor, Margaret Chowting, for the discussion, for coming up on stage, and for your views and insights here. They are very much appreciated. So we hope that we'll see you here again in 2 weeks when we're going to talk about converging and diverging views of the region, the Indo-Pacific region. To everybody who stayed with us, thank you very much for your time too. We hope that this discussion was insightful and informative for you too. Well, we wish you a great evening, a good day, also if you are in other parts of the world, and a bright new week as well. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.